The sun at noon was not a light. It was a hammer. It beat down on Dustwell Junction, flattening the color from the sky and drawing a shimmering heat from the warped planks of the depot platform. The air wavered, making the structure quiver in the glare, looking less like a station and more like a gallows waiting for its due. There was no breeze, only the smell of alkali dust, hot metal, and the sour patience of the crowd. Sheriff Abel Hollander worked that crowd, what there was of it. He was a thick man, his badge a dull star on a shirt damp with sweat. He paced beside a freestanding chalkboard, the kind usually meant for train arrivals, now wiped clean and marked with stark, fresh chalk. It read, Lot number 7, $3. Hollander wiped his palms on his trousers. He was a man who enjoyed the small authorities of his office, and this was a peculiar kind of authority. He was not selling a stray horse or a seized property. He was officiating a disposal. The crowd, 30 or so men, mostly ranchers, freighters, and rail yard hands, kept their distance, forming a loose, wary half-circle. They muttered, they spat, but they watched. Their eyes were fixed on the lot. She stood where the baggage was usually thrown, the captive, Marin Kestrel. She was not tall, but she held her space as if she were. Her chin was high, catching the only clean light in the square, a light that showed the map of dust and dried sweat on her face. Her wrists, bound before her with iron cuffs, were raw and bruised purple, the skin broken. Her hair, the color of dark, wet sand, was pulled back in a tight, functional braid, but it was not secured with ribbon. Narrow-gauge copper wire, glinting like threads of fire, was twisted into the plait. It was the braid of someone who used what they had, and who had, perhaps, been interrupted while mending a fence or running a line. She did not look at the ground. She did not look at the sheriff. She met every gaze. Her eyes were clear, the color of slate, and they held no plea. They held only a hard, settled reckoning. Pinned to the bodice of her worn cotton dress was a square of yellow pasteboard, a disease tag. A man in the front, a hostler with teeth stained brown, laughed low. $3 for that, Hollander. You'd have to pay us to take the sickness. Another joined in. Look at the wire in her hair. She's a witch. I say, cursed stock. The jeers were nervous, edged with a fear that made them cruel. They saw the tag and saw contamination. They saw the proud set of her jaw and saw defiance that needed breaking. Sheriff Hollander raised a hand, smiling as if at a fine joke. She's warranted sound. Boys, minus the, condition noted. $3 is the filing fee, is all a civic necessity. Keeps the town clean. Now, what am I bid for lot number 7? The silence that followed was heavier than the heat. The men shuffled. This was not an auction. It was a shunning. The sale was a legal trap, a piece of theater written by the railroad lawyers. The tag branded her untouchable by rumor, and the bill of sale would make her owned by paper. Whoever bought her would be buying a pariah, a burden sanctioned by the law. Marin Kestrel turned her head slowly, her eyes finding the hostler who had called her cursed. When she spoke, her voice was not the scream of a victim. It was a blade. It sliced through the thick, hot air and struck the wall of the rail office. I'd rather die. The words hung. The jeering stopped. The men looked away, suddenly finding interest in their boots or the shimmering horizon. Hollander's smile tightened. He had not accounted for the property speaking. In the shaded alley between the general store and the telegraph office, a man finished cinching a canvas tarp over a load of freight. He had been listening, trying not to, but listening all the same. He pulled the brim of his sun-cracked hat lower, but it did not hide the lines of irritation etched around his eyes. Asa Holloway did not want this. He had 2 mules, Prim and Chaff, hitched to the wagon. He had a contract to deliver mining equipment to Sable Canyon. He had enough trouble of his own, most of in the form of a conscience that had proven more expensive than whiskey and twice as stubborn. He had seen men like Hollander before. He had seen traps made of paper and ink, traps that held tighter than any iron. And he had heard that tone of voice. I'd rather die. It was not a bargain. It was the last piece of ground a person had left to stand on. He cursed, a soft, weary sound lost under the silence of the square. He stepped out of the alley. The crowd had not noticed him. He was a rangy, quiet man, built of angles and sun-baked leather. He moved like a man who spent his life walking, leading mules, and waiting. He walked past the muttering men, his boots making a soft, determined sound on the dust-packed street. He did not look at Marin. He walked directly to the platform and stopped in front of the sheriff. From his pocket, he pulled $3 silver. They were heavy, worn smooth. He did not toss them. He did not bid. He placed them, one by one, on the edge of the platform beside the chalkboard. The sound of the metal meeting the wood was distinct, final. Hollander blinked, his performance interrupted. Well now, we got a buyer, Asa Holloway. You sure about this? Freighter she's tagged. Asa looked at the sheriff. His eyes were the same color as the captive's, slate gray, but where hers held fire, his held distance. I can read the sign, he said. He laid down the money. It was not rescue money. It was not a gesture of kindness. It was $3 worth of defiance. It was the price of sleeping at night. Across the square, in the deep shade of the Black Mesa rail office porch, 2 men in clean shirts stopped watching. One, a thin clerk with a ledger under his arm, narrowed his eyes. He watched Asa, not as a savior, but as an unexpected variable. Hollander shrugged. The showman finding his footing again, he scooped up the coins, sold, to Mr. Asa Holloway, for the sum of $3. He produced a folded paper from his pocket, already written out. A bill of sale. Sign here. Asa makes it legal. Asa took the paper and the offered pencil. He read it. The language was coiled, full of clauses that absolved the town of any responsibility and bound the owner to all of it. He signed his name. He pocketed his copy of the bill of sale. Then he stepped onto the platform. The crowd took a collective step back, a soft shuffle of boots in the dust. A gasp went up. Asa walked to Marin Kestrel. She did not flinch, but her shoulders tightened, her gaze locking on his, searching him. She was a surveyor, and she was reading his topography, looking for the fault lines. He stopped in front of her. He did not touch her. He reached for the yellow tag pinned to her dress. With one quick, sharp motion, he ripped it free, tearing the pasteboard in half and leaving a small triangle of fabric still pinned to her dress. He crumpled the tag in his fist. The crowd recoiled as if he had just touched fire. They saw him as tainted now, a man who had willingly invited the curse. Sheriff Hollander watched this, his face impassive. He turned, almost casually, to the thin clerk from the rail office, who had drifted closer. Hollander muttered, just low enough for the clerk to hear, "Ambrose Kilduff will be pleased. Let him take the fuse. We'll follow the powder trail." The clerk nodded once, a faint, satisfied smile touching his lips. He turned and walked back toward the telegraph office. On the platform, Asa looked at the crumpled tag in his hand, then threw it to the planks. He drew a key from his vest pocket, the same key that fit his wagon's lockbox. He moved behind Marin, who stood rigid, tracking his every sound. He inserted the key into the cuffs. The lock clicked open. The iron fell away from her wrists. The sound was loud in the sudden, absolute silence of the square. Marin Kestrel did not rub her wrists, though the blood was already welling in the raw abrasions. She did not cry. She did not offer thanks. She simply turned her head, looking at the man who now held the paper that owned her. Her voice was raw, quiet, and held the weight of absolute certainty. "You just bought our trouble." Asa did not wait for the crowd to scatter. He moved, his boots sure on the packed earth, walking past the stunned faces of Dustwell. He did not look back at the platform, but he heard her land, a light, solid sound on the dirt behind him. He did not offer a hand. She did not ask for one. He reached his wagon. The mules, Prim and Chaff, shifted in their harnesses, sensing the tension. Marin Kestrel was already moving to the wagon bed, her hands gripping the sideboards, ready to climb over the load of mining drills and crated equipment, ride the seat, Asa said. His voice was flat. If they come, I need you where I can see you, and where you can see what is coming. She hesitated for only a second, her slate-gray eyes measuring the offer. She moved to the front, climbing up to the hard wooden bench. She did not settle. She sat as if ready to spring, her bruised wrists held carefully in her lap. Asa released the brake. He did not use the whip. He clicked his tongue once, a sharp, familiar sound. Hup, prim, chaff. The two mules leaned as one into their collars. The heavy freight wagon groaned, the wheels protesting the dust, and then it moved. The wagon rolled forward, cutting west, away from the depot, away from the silent, staring crowd. They moved past the last building of Dustwell Junction, the blacksmith's shed, and onto the open track that led toward the broken teeth of Sable Canyon. The sun was a mercy, finally beginning its long dive, gnawing at the western horizon. But it was still high enough to be a burden, casting long, stark shadows that offered no relief. The heat was a physical weight. They traveled for maybe 20 minutes. The only sounds were the jingle of the harness, the steady plod of the mules, and the rhythmic squeak of the axle. Asa kept his eyes on the mule's ears. Marin kept hers on the back trail. She saw it first, a faint, rising plume of alkali dust, pale against the deepening blue of the eastern sky. "Riders," she said. Her voice was quiet, devoid of panic. It was a statement of fact. Asa glanced over his shoulder. He did not stop the team. 4 of them. They were pushing their horses hard, eating the distance. Hollander's men. They didn't wait long, Asa muttered. He thought of the clerk's narrow eyes, the sheriff's murmur. Follow the powder trail. They must have had the horses saddled. They always do, Marin said. They expected you, or someone like you. A fool. A fuse, she corrected. He urged the mules on, but the wagon was heavy. It was built for endurance, not speed. A loaded freighter had no chance of outrunning 4 men on fresh horses. Asa scanned the landscape ahead. They were in the low basin, miles of cracked earth and stunted sagebrush before the first switchbacks of the canyon pass. They would be overtaken long before they reached the high ground. Marin pointed, not west toward the pass, but southwest, toward a shimmering white expanse that reflected the dying sun like a sheet of broken glass. "There," she said, "the salt pan." Asa looked where she pointed. It was a dry lake bed, miles across. "That is suicide. The crust is thin. Horses will founder, but this wagon will sink to the axles before we are 10 yards in. We will be trapped. Not all of it," she said, her voice sharp with an authority that surprised him. "Look, you see the scrub. How it patterns, it does not grow on the deep alkali. It follows the high ground. There is a spine of hard clay running through it. The horses will hate the salt on their legs. They will follow the spine. It is narrow. They will have to come at us single file." Asa studied the pan. Then her. She was not guessing. She was reading the land as if it were a surveyor's map, seeing the contours invisible to his eye. He did not have time to question it. The drumming of hoofs was closer now. "Are you better at running or fighting?" she asked, her gaze fixed on him. He gritted his teeth, the dust coating his tongue. "Neither. If I can help it." He pulled hard on the left rein, turning the mules. "Hup, chaff, get hup." The mules balked, smelling the caustic salt. But Asa's voice was insistent, and they obeyed, their hooves punching through a thin, brittle crust. Marin was right. Underneath, the clay was firm. The wagon wheels found purchase. They moved onto the shimmering white pan. Behind them, the 4 riders reached the edge. They slowed, their horses skittish, refusing the unstable ground. They shouted to one another, then saw the wagon's tracks cutting a dark line across the white. Just as Marin had predicted, they urged their horses onto the narrow spine of clay, their formation breaking. They were forced to follow, one by one. The chase slowed to a grim procession. The wagon held its lead. Asa scanned the horizon, seeking any advantage. His eyes settled on the north. Thin, dark poles marched across the desert, parallel to the canyon. They looked stark and unnatural against the red rock. "Telegraph," he said. "The word tasting like ash." "Rail eyes," Marin confirmed. She had not taken her eyes off their pursuers. "They are everywhere. Kilduff sees everything, even here. That is why we cannot use the main pass." "They will have a man at the telegraph station, waiting for word." They cleared the salt pan, the mules straining as they pulled the wagon onto harder ground, and dipped into a wide arroyo. The riders were closer now, having made up time on the solid earth. They were fanning out. Asa kept the mules at a steady, ground-eating trot. He broke the silence, needing to know the shape of the trouble he had bought. "This name, Kilduff. He is the railroad. He is the railroad in this territory," she corrected, her voice tight. "He is Ambrose Kilduff, and that tag Hollander pinned on me was not because I am sick. It is because I am not." She finally looked away from the back trail, turning her gaze to him. The fading light caught the fire in her eyes. "It is a false quarantine. Kilduff uses it to isolate witnesses, people who see things they should not, surveyors who will not sign false plats, homesteaders who will not move." She touched the torn fabric on her dress where the tag had been. "Once Hollander pins that on you, you are a ghost. No one will give you water. No one will sell you food. No one will shelter you. If you disappear, you did not die. You just expired. A civic necessity. Clean. Legal. Hollander is Kilduff's animal control." Asa thought of the $3, the price of illegal shunning. Hoofbeats echoed, suddenly louder, closer. They were in a wide basin now, the walls of shale and red sandstone rising on either side, amplifying the sound. "They split up," Asa said, pulling the mules to a halt behind a jutting formation of rock. He pointed up, on the basin rim. Two figures were silhouetted against the purple sky. Hollander's deputies. They had anticipated this route. "Cut them off!" a voice bellowed from the rim, echoing across the rock. "Holloway, this ain't your fight. The sheriff just wants the woman. Throw her down. Freighter, do not die for Kilduff's trash." Asa reached beside the seat, his hand finding the smooth wood stock of his carbine. He pulled it free from its scabbard, before he could lever around into the chamber. Marin's hand was on his arm. Her grip was surprisingly strong, her fingers digging into his forearm. "No," she said, "do not shoot at them. You will just start a war you cannot finish. Give it to me." He stared at her. The riders below were closing the gap. 50 yards and closing. He gave her the rifle. Her movements were economical. She checked the load, levered around, and brought the stock to her shoulder. She did not aim at the men on the rim. She did not aim at the men below. She aimed higher, at a dark scar of loose shale on the cliff face, just above the deputies. She fired. The single shot was a flat, deafening crack in the enclosed space. For a moment, nothing. Then a sharp click, a groan, and a rattling slide. The bullet had struck the unstable rock, a cascade of shale and dust, an avalanche in miniature, sheared off the cliff face. It thundered down the slope, not hitting the deputies, but pouring across the path directly in front of their horses. The animals screamed, rearing back from the crumbling, sliding earth. The deputies fought for control, cursing, pulling their mounts back from the unstable edge. It was not a lethal blow. It was a warning, a perfectly placed, undeniable warning. "A surveyor knows her geology," Marin said, her voice grim. She handed the warm carbine back to Asa. "That will not hold them for long," Asa said, his voice tight with a new, grudging respect. The riders below had pulled up, confused by the shot and the rockfall. "It does not need to hold them. It just needs to buy us seconds." She was scanning the basin wall, her eyes dissecting the shadows. "There!" She pointed to a deep undercut in the sandstone, a natural ledge shadowed by a heavy overhang. It was not a cave, just a deep recess. Asa did not hesitate. He whipped the mules. Prim chaff. Get. He drove the team hard, backing the heavy wagon into the recess. It was a tight fit. The wagon itself disappeared into the gloom, but the mules and the front of the wagon were still visible. "The tarp," he yelled. He scrambled onto the wagon bed. untying the ropes that held the heavy, oiled canvas over his freight. Together, they hauled it, the canvas stiff and heavy. They dragged it over the wagon, over the nervous, stamping mules, pulling it down to the ground. They anchored the corners with heavy rocks from the arroyo floor. They had created an improvised alcove of shade and silence. They slid under the tarp, crouching in the darkness between the wagon wheel and the rock wall. It was hot and smelled of canvas, dust, and the warm animal scent of the mules. Asa could hear Marin's breathing, quick and shallow. He could feel the heat radiating from her body, inches from his own. The riders thundered past the mouth of the basin. They stopped. "Where did they go?" one shouted. The deputies from the ridge were shouting down, their voices muffled. "They are in here. The shot came from the basin. They did not come out." Asa held his breath. Prim, his lead mule, shuffled under the canvas. Asa put a hand on her muzzle, murmuring softly. One rider, bolder than the others, started to turn his horse, peering into the shadows of the basin wall, moving directly toward their ledge. And then the air changed. In the center of the basin, the evening calm was broken. The wind, trapped by the high walls, began to twist. A column of dust, leaves, and grit spun up from the floor. A dust devil. It formed with violent speed, a whining, churning funnel of red debris. It raced across the basin, directly toward the riders. The men cursed, shielding their faces as the stinging grit hit them. Their horses panicked, rearing and turning their backs to the sudden storm. For a full minute, the basin was chaos, a blinding, howling cloud of red dust. Under the tarp, Marin peered through a tiny gap in the canvas, watching the red chaos. When the funnel passed, moving on down the arroyo, the world was still again. But the basin floor was changed. The wagon ruts that led to their hiding place were gone, wiped clean, scoured from the earth. The riders regrouped, coughing, their eyes watering. They were disoriented. They argued, pointing west toward the main canyon, convinced their quarry had slipped by them in the blinding dust. Finally, the lead rider swore and spurred his horse deeper into the canyon system. The others followed. Their hoofbeats faded into the distance. Asa waited. He counted to 100. Twice, his breath held tight in his chest. Finally, he let it out. Beside him, Marin released her own breath. A small, tight smirk touched her lips. It was a humor as dry as the dust that coated them. "Even the wind picks sides sometimes," she whispered. They waited until the last light was gone, until the sky was a deep, bruised indigo, punctured by the first stars. Night came fast, and with it, a sharp, cold air. The first coyotes began to yip, their calls sharp and lonely in the vast, empty basin. Asa pushed the heavy tarp back, letting the cool air wash over them. The mules shook their heads, their harnesses jingling. He got his canteen and poured water into his hat, letting Prim and Chaff drink first. They had earned it. He offered the canteen to Marin. She drank, her throat working, and handed it back. In the far, far distance, beyond the canyon walls, a new sound cut through the desert night. It was not a coyote. It was a low, metallic cough, a rhythmic, chuffing breath, a locomotive. It sounded closer than it should have, much closer. Asa swore softly, the words swallowed by the open space. He stared north, into the dark. "Railroad's closer than it looks," he said, his voice flat. "So is whoever wants you back." He drove for another 2 miles, pushing the weary mules deeper into the maze of canyons. The moon was only a sliver, offering just enough light to turn the basalt cliffs into towering, black shadows. Asa knew this land. He had freighted equipment through here before. He turned the wagon off the main track, guiding Prim and Chaff through a narrow gap in the rock, barely wide enough for the wagon to pass. The gap opened into a natural amphitheater, a perfect horseshoe of black, volcanic rock that shielded them from the wind and, more importantly, from any eyes on the canyon rims. It was a pocket of deep silence. He pulled the mules to a halt. He did not unhitch them. Not yet. He sat for a long minute, listening. The only sound was the heavy breathing of the animals and the faint click of the wagon axles cooling. "We stay here," he said, his voice low, "at least until first light." He got down from the bench, his joints stiff. Marin followed, landing softly on the sandy ground. She moved to the back of the wagon, her movement stiff but purposeful, and began to unstrap a long, leather tube from her own bedroll, which had been tossed in the back. Asa watched her for a moment before turning to his mules. He gave them water in the canvas bucket, then grain. Their quiet munching was a comfort. He built no fire. A fire was a beacon. He allowed himself only a small tin of coals, brought from the blacksmith's forge in Dustwell, meant for mending harness. He nestled it between 3 rocks, and the faint red glow cast just enough heat to cut the high desert chill. The embers clicked and settled. He sat on his heels, staring into the low, pulsing light. She sat on the other side of the embers, her map case held across her lap like a rifle. A wary truce held the space between them. Finally, he took his canteen, drank, and passed it to her, hand to hand. She took it, her eyes never leaving his face as she drank. The metal of the canteen grazed her split lip. She passed it back. "You are a surveyor," he stated. It was not a question. "The way you shot, the way you read the salt pan, that was not a guess." "A cartographer," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "A map maker. I was hired by the county, supposedly, but the pay came from the Black Mesa rail." She laid the leather tube on the ground and pulled the cap free. She slid out a rolled vellum sheet. "They are stealing the land," she said. It was that simple. Kilduff has been at it for a year. He is not just taking the land the government granted him. He is moving the land, on paper. She unrolled the map. It was beautiful work, precise, the contour lines drawn with an artist's hand. She pointed to a section line. "This is section 22, the official plat, filed in 58. Here is the Garnet River. Here is the spring." She then pulled a second, rougher sheet from the tube. It was a field survey, her own, covered in graphite notes. "This is the land as it is. Kilduff's engineers, they filed new plats, forged. They shifted the section lines a half-mile east. Their maps put the river and the spring on section 21. His section, they dried out 22, made it worthless, and bought it from the homesteaders for pennies. They forged the section line plats," Asa murmured, understanding the scale of the crime. "And they needed them certified," Marin continued, her voice hardening. "They needed a licensed surveyor to sign, to swear the new maps were true. That was my job. I was supposed to see the clerical errors and fix them. I refused. I told them I would report the fraud to the General Land Office." She looked up from the map, her gaze locking with his across the glowing embers. 2 days later, Sheriff Hollander found me in my office. He had the tag. He said I had been reported, contagious, a danger. He took my instruments, my notes, my horse. He took everything, except these. She tapped the map case. "I keep my field surveys on me, always." Asa stared at the map. He saw the elegant lines, the stark, brutal theft they represented. The ink on the paper was as final as a pistol shot. He picked up a piece of dry mesquite and pushed it into the embers, the end glowing. "Survey teams," he said, his voice hollow. "I used to scout for them, for the army." Marin stilled, her gaze sharpened, dissecting him. "It was not rail," he went on, needing to say it, needing to draw his own map for her. "It was, before, after the war, the army needed maps of the new territory. They paid me to find the routes, to find the water, the good land, the hidden springs, the flat passes." He looked at his own hands, calloused and stained. "I was good at it. I could read the land, just like you. I found the water. I put it on their maps." He laughed, a short, bitter sound. "And right behind the army came the land agents, the speculators, the Kilduffs of the world. They used my maps to find the springs, and they filed on them before anyone else knew they were there. They choked off the valleys. I drew the lines they used to cage people. The guilt was always there, a dull ache under his ribs, like old shrapnel. Tonight, sitting across from her, it was sharp. He had been the vanguard of the very men who had destroyed her. The silence returned, heavier this time. He looked at her wrists, resting on her knees. The bruises were dark in the faint light, the skin broken and crusted with dried blood from the iron cuffs. He stood abruptly. He went to his wagon and dug into his gear, past the chains and the canvas, finding the small wooden box that held his personal effects. He pulled out a small bottle of carbolic, a roll of clean muslin, and his whetstone. He took the bottle and the muslin. When he returned, she had not moved, but she watched him, wary as a hawk. "Give me your hands," he said. She flinched. Her whole body went rigid. "Why, those cuffs. The iron was foul. They will poison you if they are not cleaned." She stared at him, her jaw tight, suspicion warring with the clear pain in her eyes. Slowly, agonizingly, she extended her hands toward him, palms down. He knelt in front of her. He uncorked the bottle and poured a small amount of the antiseptic onto a strip of muslin. "This will sting." He reached out, not grabbing, but gently taking her right wrist in his hand. His thumb rested on her pulse point. Her skin was ice cold, but her pulse was a fast, terrified drumbeat against his thumb. "Easy," he murmured, his voice rough. He touched the damp cloth to the raw abrasion. Marin inhaled sharply, a hiss of pain through her teeth, but she did not pull away. Her entire body was trembling, a fine, high-strung vibration. He worked quickly, his fingers careful, his touch deliberate. He was a freighter, a man used to mending heavy, broken things, yet his hands were surprisingly gentle, cleaning the grit and the rust from the wounds. He moved to the left wrist. She did not tremble this time. He felt the tension in her forearm, the muscle knotted tight as hard wood. He wrapped the first wrist in a clean, dry strip of muslin. He was focused on the task, on the knot, his head bowed. He was acutely aware of the stillness that had fallen over her. He could feel the warmth of her body, smell the faint, clean scent of sage that clung to her hair, mixed with the metallic tang of dried sweat and fear. He began to tie the knot on the second bandage. His knuckles brushed the soft, pale skin of her inner arm. He felt the change in her. The rapid, shallow panic of her breathing suddenly slowed. It did not stop, but it deepened, becoming a slow, measured cadence. He felt the muscle in her arm, under his hand, unclench. The small sound of her breath, the release of that iron-hard tension, struck him harder than her shot in the basin. He fumbled the knot. He tried again, his fingers suddenly clumsy. He could feel the heat radiating from her skin, the close-quarters heat of another human being, held in a moment of absolute vulnerability. He finished the knot, pulling it snug but not tight. He did not look at her face. He could not. He looked at his own hands, then at the wrapped bandage, then away, out into the blackness of the basalt horseshoe. He let go of her wrist and rocked back on his heels, putting a foot of distance between them. Marin drew her hands back, cradling them in her lap. She flexed her fingers, testing the bandages. She watched him. He had looked away. The moment the task was done, the moment the contact became less about medicine and more about something else. He had retreated. He had moved like a man touching a hot stove. She studied his stance, the tight set of his shoulders, the way he stared into the dark as if seeing ghosts. She had seen men who were dangerous to others. They looked at her with hunger, or greed, or rage. Asa Holloway looked at her, and at himself, with a profound, weary guilt. She made her assessment, the way she would assess a rock formation or a riverbed. He was dangerous, yes, but only to himself. "The map," she said, her voice softer than before. Pulling him back, he turned, the tension broken. He brought the single lantern from the wagon, lit it, and set it between them. The small, yellow flame pushed back the dark. "Hollander will not stop," she said. "Kilduff will not stop. They cannot let me get to the land office in Garnet Bluff." Asa leaned forward, drawn back to the practical. Garnet Bluff is 50 miles. We will never make it, not in this wagon. They will have riders at every pass." She was already shaking her head. "Not Garnet Bluff, not yet. They will expect that. They will watch the main routes. We have to go where they are not." She unrolled her own field map again, weighting the corners with rocks. Asa leaned in, his gaze tracing the lines she had drawn. The lantern light was bright between them, painting her face in strokes of gold and shadow. Her braid had come partly undone, the copper wire glinting, and a stray strand of dark hair fell across her cheek. They both leaned over the map case. Their heads were close, their shoulders nearly brushing. A shared lean, a brief hush broken only by the click of the dying embers. He could feel her breath on his cheek. He did not move. He did not look away. "Here," she whispered, her finger tracing a series of coordinates. "Juniper Pass. It is a longer route, a harder one, but it leads to the old mission, St. Elora. The telegraph does not run there." Asa frowned, studying the map. "That is hard country, broken, barely a track, but it is my country," she said. "I have surveyed every foot of it. I know the fault lines." He looked from the map to her face. The resolve there was absolute. He saw the path forward, not as a retreat, but as a fight. He made a mistake then, the mistake of a man trying to mend what was not his to fix. "I can get you to the mission," he said, his voice low. "You can be safe there. I can ride on, draw them off, create a false trail." Marin looked up from the map. Her eyes, which had been soft in the lantern light, hardened again to slate. She drew a boundary, not on the vellum, but in the air between them. "You bought me for $3. Freighter. You did not buy my fight." Her voice was not angry. It was cold steel. "I am not cargo to be delivered. I am going to Garnet Bluff, and I am going to use these maps to tear down Ambrose Kilduff. You can help me, or you can get out of my way, but do not try to fix me." Asa met her gaze. He saw his error. He saw the fire he had almost smothered. He had offered her a cage, just a different kind. He nodded slowly, a sign of respect, of agreement. "Lines matter," he said, tapping the map. "We will keep to them." The truce was over. A partnership had begun. In the deep dark, far beyond their sanctuary of rock, a lone coyote yodeled, the sound a thin, sharp cry of hunger. Asa doused the lantern. He took the first watch, his carbine across his knees. Marin settled against a wagon wheel, pulling her bedroll tight, but she did not sleep. In the blackness, Asa heard her whispering. Not prayers, but numbers, coordinates, distances, calculations. She was plotting the fight, one line at a time. The journey to Juniper Pass took 2 days. 2 days of pushing the mules through a broken, unforgiving landscape that Marin seemed to read by instinct. She directed him away from dry washes that looked easy but were soft sand, and toward rock-strewn ridges that looked impossible but offered firm footing. They traveled cold, eating dried beef and hardtack, speaking only when the land demanded it. The wary truce of their first night had been replaced by a wordless, working partnership. He drove. She navigated. Juniper Pass was not a pass at all, but a high, narrow cut in the mesa, a scar of red rock barely 10 feet wide. The wind howled through it, a high-pitched, mournful sound. The air was thin and cold. Asa pulled the mules to a stop at the mouth of the cut. Prim and Chaff were weary, their heads low, their breath pluming in the chill. "This is it," Marin said, her voice low. She had been walking ahead for the last hour, scouting, her carbine in hand. She stood just inside the shadow of the pass. "It feels wrong," Asa said. He scanned the rim rock above them. "It is too quiet, too perfect a trap. It is the only way north that is not watched by the telegraph," she said. "That does not mean it is not watched by men." A voice, calm and oiled, echoed from the rocks to their left. "The freighter is a smart man. You should have listened to him. Miss Kestrel." Asa's hand went to the carbine, but he froze. 3 men. One stood on a ledge to their left, 20 feet up. He was dressed in a clean, dark duster, a city hat on his head. He was clean-shaven, and his eyes were the color of a winter sky. He held a Winchester rifle as if it were a walking stick. The other two, rougher, bearded men, emerged on horseback from the far end of the pass, blocking the exit. They held shotguns, their barrels dark and wide. They were boxed in. That is far enough. "Holloway," the man on the ledge said. He did not raise his voice. The acoustics of the pass carried it for him. "My name is Eames Rook. My associates are Mr. Lyle and Mr. March. We are here on behalf of the Black Mesa Rail Company. They are very eager to recover their property." Asa looked from Rook to the two men blocking the way. These were not Hollander's bumbling deputies. These were professionals. Rook's cold eyes flicked to Asa. "I have the report from Dustwell. You bought the lady for $3. A sentimental purchase." He smiled. A thin, unpleasant expression. "A nice leash. Holloway." Asa felt his knuckles tighten on the reins. He thought of the bill of sale in his pocket. "Paper cuts both ways," he said, his voice flat. Rook's smile did not waver. "It does indeed. Now, be a sensible man. We are not here for you. We are not even, strictly speaking, here for her. We are here for the maps. Hand over the leather case, Miss Kestrel, and we will let Mr. Holloway go on his way." And me, Marin's voice was as cold as Rook's. "You, Miss Kestrel, are a fugitive from a lawful quarantine. You will be returned to Sheriff Hollander's custody for the good of public health." "No," Asa said. Rook sighed. A theatrical display of patience. "Mr. Holloway, do not be a fool." He nodded to the men at the end of the pass. "Mr. Lyle, persuade him. Picket Lyle," the heavier of the two, cocked his shotgun. The double click was deafening in the narrow space. Marin had not moved. Her eyes were fixed on the rock face just above Eames Rook. She saw it, a dark, vertical crack in the sandstone, a fault seam heavy with loose rock. She did not look at Asa. She did not speak. She simply lifted her chin, a sharp, deliberate motion, marking the fault line. It was a communication of pure trust, a surveyor's signal. Asa saw it. He did not question. He did not aim at Rook, nor at Lyle or March. He dropped the reins, snatched the carbine from his scabbard, levered around, and fired in one fluid, desperate motion. The shot was a flat crack. Rook, startled, ducked as the bullet sang past his head, striking the rock precisely where Marin had indicated. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, a sound like a giant's groan. The fault seam split. A slab of red rock the size of a wagon sheared outward, striking the ledge Rook stood on and shattering. A ton of stone and shale avalanched into the pass, pouring down between them and Rook. The Pinkerton cursed, scrambling backward to avoid being swept away. The horses at the far end of the pass screamed as the ground shook and rocks rained down. Lyle and March fought their panicked mounts. Blinded by the sudden, choking cloud of red dust, now Marin yelled. Asa did not need to be told. He laid the whip across the mules' backs for the first and only time. Hup, get! The mules lunged, terrified, pulling the wagon forward into the settling dust. They thundered past Rook's position, under the crumbling stone. There Marin pointed. The rock fall had almost completely blocked the pass, but to the right, where the cliff was undercut, there was a narrow slit, a dark gap. Asa hauled on the reins, skidding the wagon, the wheels screaming as they scraped the canyon wall. He aimed the mules at the gap. They plunged through the slit of falling dust and emerged on the other side. The pass opened up onto a high, wind-blasted plateau, and a chasm, a gorge, 50 yards across and hundreds of feet deep, split the plateau. The only way across was a rope bridge, a swaying, flimsy-looking thing of wood slats and frayed cable, built for miners, not for a 2-ton freight wagon. Behind them, they heard Rook shouting, his voice enraged. "They are through. Find a way around, find it. We have to cross," Marin said. "It is the only way. The wagon will never make it," Asa said, his voice grim. "We are not taking the wagon." She was already moving, unhitching Prim from the harness, her hands quick and sure. "We take the mules and what we can carry, the maps, the guns. The water! Asa nodded, his mind racing. He unhitched Chaff. A rifle shot echoed from the pass, the bullet whining off the rock high above them. Rook's men were coming. The mules balked at the bridge, the wind whistling through the ropes, the slats rattling. Prim, the lead mule, planted her feet, refusing to move, her eyes wide with terror. Asa! The grain Marin yelled. He tossed her the small sack of oats. She poured some onto her hand, but the mule was too frightened. Blind her, Asa said. Marin understood. She slipped the empty grain sack over Prim's head, covering her eyes. She put a hand on the mule's neck, speaking softly, her voice a low, calming murmur. It is all right. It is just the ground. Trust me. Come on. She took the bridle and stepped onto the bridge. She began to crawl, keeping her center of gravity low, her boots finding purchase on the wooden slats. Come on, Prim, easy now. Good girl. The mule, blind and trusting the voice, took a hesitant step, then another. The bridge groaned under the animal's weight. Asa grabbed Chaff's bridle. Your turn, you stubborn beast! He followed Marin, the second mule clattering onto the planks behind him. The bridge swung wildly, a nauseating pendulum motion. Below them, the chasm floor was a distant, rocky ribbon. The wind tore at them, trying to peel them from the bridge. They were halfway across. Crack. A new sound. A rifle shot. Much closer. Eames Rook had found a high-angle perch on the cliff overlooking the chasm. Thwack, a stray round, fired from above, struck the bridge. It did not hit flesh. It hit the thick rope lashing that anchored the bridge's left-hand cable to the far stanchion. The rope snapped. The bridge did not fall. It lurched, dropping 3 feet on one side, throwing them against the remaining cable. Marin, in front, screamed as she was slammed against the rock face of the far cliff. Prim screamed, a high, terrified sound, her hooves slipping. Asa was thrown sideways. He lost his grip on Chaff's bridle and the rock. He was swinging free, dangling by one hand from a wooden slat, hundreds of feet above the rocks. The mule Chaff, in a panic, scrambled forward, pushing past him, and miraculously found its footing on the far side. Asa swung, his boots finding no purchase. His one hand was slipping, the wood slick with sweat. Above him, on the rim, he saw Rook stand, taking careful aim, preparing the finishing shot. Marin was on the far ledge, 20 feet away. She had the carbine. She did not scream for him. She did not panic. She scrambled to her feet, raised the rifle, and fired. Her eyes were like cooled iron. She did not fire at Rook. She fired at the rock just beside his head, the shale exploding, stinging his face with stone chips. He cursed and dropped back into cover. Asa roared, a sound of pure, desperate rage. He let go of the slat. He fell, 2 feet, and slammed hard against the bridge's vertical support beam. The main stanchion set into the cliff face. Rook rose again. Marin fired again, the shot quicker this time. Asa, his body pressed to the wood, drew his boot knife. He had one chance. With his free hand, he slammed the blade, point first, into the thick wooden stanchion. The steel bit deep. It held. Using the knife as a handhold, his muscles screaming, he hauled himself up. He grabbed the edge of the cliff. Marin fired a third time, forcing Rook to stay down. Asa rolled onto the solid ground, his chest heaving, his hand bleeding where the knife hilt had torn the skin. He was alive. He looked at Marin. She was already reloading, her hands steady. She had not looked away from Rook's position. We have to go, she said. Asa nodded, pulling his knife free. He went to the remaining cable and, with a single savage cut, severed the rope. The bridge fell away, cartwheeling into the chasm, taking Rook's last hope of pursuit with it. They heard a final, enraged shot. The bullet whining harmlessly into the empty space. They grabbed the mules. They ran. They did not stop until they were a mile away, plunging down a steep mule track that led into a shallow, damp canyon. Ashbriar Wash. The bottom was covered in ankle-deep water, spring-fed and cold. running over smooth stones. It would drown their tracks, leaving no trace. Asa finally stopped, leaning against a cottonwood, gasping for air. The adrenaline was leaving him, his body shaking with a violent, delayed reaction. He looked at Marin, at the mules, at the sky. He let out one sharp bark of laughter. It was a sound of pure disbelief. Marin did not laugh. She was checking the carbine, sliding new rounds into the magazine, her brow furrowed. What Asa asked, the laugh dying in his throat. She looked up, her eyes hard, focused, already a mile ahead. "I am counting," she said. He fired 5 times. That Pinkerton. Lyle and March had shotguns. "I am counting how many bullets Rook has left." Back at the chasm, Eames Rook stared at the severed rope, his face a mask of cold fury. He turned and walked back toward the pass, toward the abandoned freight wagon. He began to search it, tearing at the canvas, throwing crates to the ground. He found nothing, no maps, no notes. But as he turned to leave, his boot struck something in the mud where the wagon had stood. He bent down. He picked up a small, crumpled piece of yellow pasteboard. It was torn, muddy, but the lettering was still visible. A disease tag. Rook looked at the tag. He smoothed it out. A slow, thin smile crossed his face. A smile like a man who had just found a key. They followed Ashbriar Wash until the water sank into the deep sand, then cut north, traveling only in the pre-dawn light in the deep dusk. Marin navigated by the stars and the angle of the mesas, her memory a map that could not be stolen. The mules, Prim and Chaff, were gaunt, their ribs showing, but they trusted Usa's hands and kept walking. St. Elora Mission was not a beacon. It was a low, sprawling adobe structure, its white paint blistered by the sun, its bell tower casting a long, lonely shadow. It looked less like a sanctuary and more like a fortress that had already lost its war. A woman was waiting by the gate, as if she had been standing there for a day. She was tall, dressed in a simple, dark habit. Her face a roadmap of sharp angles and deep lines. She did not look serene. She looked impatient. "You are late," she said. Her voice was like dry gravel. Her eyes, the color of strong coffee, took in Asa's blood-caked hand, the exhaustion in Marin's stance, the weary droop of the mules. "You bring trouble." "It found us first," Asa said. "It always does when Ambrose Kilduff is involved." The woman pushed the heavy, creaking gate open. "I am Sister Calanthe Doyle. Bring the mules to the livery. The children will water them. Doctor, Bramhall is in the infirmary. He is expecting you." The infirmary was a long, cool room that smelled of carbolic acid, dried herbs, and boiled linens. Doctor Otis Bramhall was the opposite of the sister. He was a small, fussy man with wire-rimmed spectacles that kept sliding down his nose. He flinched when Asa entered, as if the freighter carried the desert's violence in with him. "Sit, sit," Bramhall whispered, gesturing to a stool. He looked at Asa's hand, the one he had gashed with his own boot knife on the bridge. The wound was inflamed, the skin around it red and angry. "This is butcher's work. Mr. Holloway." Bramhall clucked, his hands fluttering. "Brute force. You are lucky you did not sever the tendon. This will require stitching." Asa just grunted, bracing himself as the doctor began to clean the wound. The alcohol was a white-hot fire, but he did not move. His ego was stung worse than his hand. He had dangled from that bridge, a target, and it was Marin's steady nerve that had covered his escape. He hated the feeling of being saved. Across the room, Sister Calanthe tended to Marin. Her touch, unlike her voice, was surprisingly gentle. She soaked the muslin bandages Asa had tied, peeling them carefully from the raw, rope-burned abrasions on Marin's wrists. "He did a fair job," Calanthe noted, her voice low. "But the iron and the rope, they leave their own poison." She applied a thick, dark salve that smelled of pine tar and wintergreen. Marin's shoulders, which had been knotted with tension, relaxed, just slightly. "You loathe Kilduff," Marin said. It was not a question. Calanthe paused, her hand still. "Loathing is a luxury. Child, I operate on necessity. Ambrose Kilduff is a blight, and I am an ex-nurse. I know a disease when I see one. She gestured with her chin toward the small courtyard, where 3 small children were chasing a ball of rags, their laughter thin in the high desert air. "Those are the mission orphans," Calanthe said, her voice hardening. "They are the last of the families from Juniper Creek. Last winter, Kilduff's men evicted them, seized the section line. He claimed their spring was on his land. He turned 20 children out into the snow. Dr. Bramhall, stitching Asa's hand with quick, nervous movements, chimed in. His voice was a reedy whisper, but it held a core of pure rage. "And I," he said, not looking up from his needle, "am the county registrar, or I was, until I started noticing the filings, the discrepancies. I was encouraged to retire. For my health," he tied off the last stitch and snipped the thread. He went to a heavy, locked cabinet and pulled out a sheaf of thin, flimsy papers. "Kilduff thinks he controls the wire. He thinks the telegraph is his private messenger. But the operators, they are not all loyal. They make extra copies." He spread the papers on the table under the room's single lantern. They were telegraph copies, ghost-like imprints of official filings from the Garnet Bluff courthouse. "Look," Bramhall said, his finger tapping the paper. "The deed for Section 21. The land Kilduff seized from the orphans. Filed on April 10th. A lawful, binding date." He then pointed to another spot on the page. "But the survey stamp. The official certification. It is dated May 1st. The filing precedes the survey by 3 weeks. It is impossible. It is blatant fraud." Marin, who had been listening with a surveyor's stillness, suddenly moved. The fatigue fell away from her like a shed skin. Her eyes, which had been dull with exhaustion, lit with a cold, focused fire. She went to the corner and retrieved her leather map case. She had not let it out of her sight since Dustwell. She unrolled her own vellum field notes, the ones she had nearly died for. She laid them directly over Bramhall's telegraph copies. The lantern light shone through the 2 layers of paper, creating a ghostly overlay. "He is not just shifting the lines," she whispered. Her voice was tight, vibrating. "He is shifting the rivers." Asa, his hand now bandaged, leaned in beside her. Calanthe and Bramhall pressed close. "Here," Marin pointed, her finger tracing a contour line on her map. Bramhall's copy shows Kilduff's deed line. It runs straight, just as the original government survey from 1858 did. Her finger then tapped her own map, the one she had drawn. "But my field notes show the land as it is. The river itself. It has 2 new bends here, an oxbow that formed after the floods 2 years ago. The original plat is obsolete. It is a lie." Asa saw it instantly. The legal and the real. "The new bends," he said, his voice rough. "They put the water source on the other side of the line." Marin finished. "On the section he seized from the orphans. He is contradicting himself." He filed using the old map, claiming the new water. He is using 2 different truths to steal 1 piece of land. "We have him," she said, looking up at them, her face fierce in the lantern light. "We have him on paper. We take these to the marshal in Garnet Bluff. We go to the courthouse. The evidence is undeniable." Asa shook his head, the motion sharp, the stitches in his hand pulled tight. "No, that is the plan that got you a disease tag. A courthouse Kilduff owns the courthouse. He owns the clerks. He probably owns the marshal. You walk in with those papers, you will be in a cell, or in a grave, before the ink is dry." The fire in her eyes turned on him. "So what is your plan?" "Freighter. Shoot our way in, we cannot fight his whole railroad." "Spectacle," Asa said, his voice low. "You are right. He is using 2 truths. So we show them to the people. We show them all at once. Kilduff cannot jail an entire town. He cannot put a disease tag on 100 witnesses. You want records. I want people to see." The argument hung in the air, unfinished, later, the tension still thick between them. Asa went to the livery. The smell of hay, old leather, and the animal warmth of the mules was a comfort. He checked Prim and Chaff, his hands gentle on their flanks. He was a freighter. He understood motion, not courtrooms. Marin followed him in. The sound of her boots was soft on the straw-covered earth. She had her own saddle, recovered from the depot by one of Calanthy's men, slung over a rail. She began to tighten the cinch, but her newly bandaged wrists made the work clumsy. She winced as she pulled, the new salve smearing on the leather. Asa moved, not speaking. He stepped in front of her, into her space, and took the leather cinch from her hand. The livery was a small, close space. A single lantern hung from a beam, casting them in intimate, wavering shadow. He was close enough to see the fine lines of exhaustion around her eyes, the way the pulse beat in her throat. He bent to the task, his movements efficient. He pulled the strap tight, his muscles bunching. She did not step back. She watched him work. When he finished, his hands were still on the saddle, his head bowed. She lifted her hand, the one wrapped in clean white muslin. She rested it, palm down, on his forearm. His arm was solid muscle, tense as a drawn bowstring. He stopped breathing. He did not move. His gaze lifted slowly from the saddle and met hers. The air in the livery became thick, heavy. The only sound was the soft munching of the mules in their stalls, the distant cry of a nighthawk. Her palm was warm, a steady pressure on his arm. It was not a gesture of restraint. It was a gesture of deliberate connection, an anchor in the storm they were living. She leaned in. It was a slow, fractional movement. Her face tilted up to his. He saw the hard slate of her eyes soften, the color deepening in the lantern light. Her breath, warm and tasting of the week, bitter tea Calanthy had given them, touched his cheek. He did not move. He did not pull her closer. He did not pull away. He was held fast by the simple, terrifying weight of her hand on his arm, by the question in her eyes. She stopped, just shy. Her lips were inches from his. He could see the small, split-second decision flicker in her gaze. The choice. She was not running from the heat. She was choosing to master it. It was the crackle of a slow-burning fuse, a promise of ignition. Not the explosion itself. She held his gaze for one more long, silent heartbeat, then let her hand fall from his arm. The connection was broken, but the current remained, sharp and humming in the air between them. When they returned to the small infirmary, the argument was over. They both knew a court was not enough. Sister Calanthy was waiting. She looked from Asa to Marin, her dark eyes missing nothing. She pressed a small, flat tin into Marin's hand. Quinine. Calanthy said, "I do not have a fever," Marin replied, confused. Calanthy's gaze flicked to Asa, then back to Marin. "For fever, of the body, or of the heart, both can make a person foolish." Marin pocketed the tin. She looked at Dr. Bramhall. Founders Day. She said, "In Garnet Bluff, next week." Bramhall looked up, his spectacles slipping. "But the whole town will be there. The legislature, the press from the Capitol." "Exactly," Asa said, a grim smile touching his lips. "The whole town is watching. The press is drunk. Kilduff will be on a platform, giving a speech. It is the perfect spectacle." They agreed. That was the plan. A sense of sharp, dangerous purpose settled the room. Marin began to carefully roll her maps. Outside, in the dusk, the mission bell rang. Clang. A single, sharp sound that cut through the evening calm. Calanthy froze. Her hand, resting on the table, gripped the wood. Asa moved to the window. A shadow, long and stark in the fading light, was crossing the courtyard. The shadow of a man in a city hat and a long duster, moving with an unnerving, patient gait. A shadow that did not belong. Eames Rook. Clang. The bell rang a second time. A sharp, urgent echo. Calanthy's face went white. She grabbed Marin's arm, her fingers digging in. "That is the code. Not for visitors. Not for warning." She shoved them toward a back door. The one that led to the livery. "That is the code for run now." They fled the mission as the bell rang its frantic, final code. They did not run toward the road. They ran toward the high desert. Calanthy's voice shouting "Fire, fire" at the stables behind them. A desperate, brilliant diversion to buy them seconds. Rook's voice, a cold, sharp command, cut through the fabricated chaos, but it was too late. Asa and Marin, mounted on Prim and Chaff, were already shadows melting into the deeper shadows of the arroyo. They rode north for a full night, pushing the mules to their limit. Their destination was not Garnet Bluff. It was a rail spur 30 miles east, a desolate siding where the circus trains and traveling troops wintered, or repaired their wagons. It was Calanthy's last, desperate instruction. Find Harlow. He hates Kilduff more than I do. Show him this. She had pressed an old, carved wooden token into Ace's hand. They found Harlow and Son's carousel troupe encamped in a box canyon, a chaotic, colorful refuge of painted wagons, half-built rides, and the smell of sawdust and animal dung. Harlow himself was a man built like a barrel, with a magnificent white mustache and hands permanently stained with grease and paint. Asa presented the token. Harlow looked at it, then at the two exhausted figures before him. Calanthy. He rumbled. That old hawk. She sends me nothing but trouble. He tossed the token back to Asa. Kilduff's railroad bypassed my town. Killed it dead. Any man who bleeds Kilduff is a friend of this troop. You need to hide. You hide in plain sight. The plan was forged in the back of a wagon, over a map lit by a sputtering kerosene lamp. The spectacle Asa wanted required preparation. First, the broadsheets. While Asa and Marin hid with the troop, Dr. Bramhall and Sister Calanthy worked the mission's old hand press. It was slow, laborious work. The clang of the press handle, the shush of the ink roller. They set the type by hand, their fingers stained black. The headline was stark, intended to hit like a rock land stolen by fake surveys. The text was simple, direct, naming the sections, naming the families, and at the bottom, a few's full ledgers inside the Black Mesa rail safe. Harlow's roustabouts, moving their own wagons of supplies into Garnet Bluff for the Founders' Day celebration, smuggled the bundled sheets, hiding them under canvas and carousel ponies. The disguises came next. Asa, with his mules, blended easily. He was given the rough-spun clothes of a roustabout. His job to haul water and feed for the troop's animals. It gave him cover. Marin was the problem. She was too sharp, her eyes too intelligent. She did not look like a dancer or an acrobat. Harlow studied her. You do not look like you belong in a circus. He said, you look like you see things other people do not, the future, the truth. He found her a dark velvet skirt, a silk shawl shot through with faded gold thread, and a box of glass beads. You are Madame Meridian, our fortune reader. People will come to you, tell you their secrets, and never once look at your face. They will be too busy staring at their own futures. It was perfect. From a small, shadowed tent at the edge of the camp, Madame Meridian had a clear view of the Black Mesa rail station, while Asa, the invisible roustabout, walked the depot, counting paces and studying the switch lists. Marin sketched, her drawing book filled with maps, not of rivers, but of the rail yard, drawn entirely from memory, her eye as precise as a surveyor's transit. She mapped the guard patrols, the switch times, the location of the water tower. The safe was the problem. It was in Kilduff's main office at Black Mesa, impregnable. We cannot get to the safe, Asa said, frustrated, cleaning a harness in the dusk. The plan dies there. Then we move the safe, Marin said, not looking up from her sketch. The telegraph was the key. Dr. Bramhall, with his knowledge of the codes and schedules, was their ghost in the wire. They waited. 2 days before Founders' Day, Bramhall sent the message. It was a perfectly forged double send, appearing to originate from the regional hub, routed through a secondary station to cover its tracks. It was a high-priority, encrypted order, addressed to the Black Mesa station master. It cited an urgent discrepancy in the regional audit. It commanded the station master to transfer the primary office safe containing all ledgers from the past 6 months to the Garnet Bluff depot for immediate inspection. The transfer was to be made on the afternoon of Founders' Day. The station master, a man terrified of Kilduff, was even more terrified of a regional audit, with the Founders' Day gala and the fireworks occupying every official in town. He would not dare bother his boss. He would obey the wire. The safe would be moved. Vulnerable. Onto a mail car. It would sit at the depot, waiting for an inspector who would never arrive, while the whole town was distracted by speeches and whiskey. With the plan in motion, the tension shifted. It became a sharp, humming wire. The night before Founder's Day, Harlow's wife, a stern woman named Elspeth, brought Marin a dress. It was not a costume. It was a deep navy blue, almost black, made of heavy, smooth cotton, with a simple, clean cut. It had belonged to a singer who had left the troupe months ago. "You cannot meet the devil in rags," Elspeth said, handing it to her. "You must look like you own the ground he stands on." Marin took it to the fitting tent. When she emerged, the camp had fallen quiet. Asa was coiling a rope, his back to her. "Will it work?" she asked. He turned. He stopped. The rope in his hands went slack. He had only ever seen her in the worn, dust-caked dress from Dustwell, or the borrowed skirt of Madame Meridian. This dress, it did not soften her. It focused her. The dark, clean lines made her look taller, her skin paler, the slate of her eyes deeper. The copper wire was gone from her hair, which she had brushed out and tied back with a simple black ribbon. Asa's throat was dry. He fumbled for words. "That, it suits you, Marin." It was the clumsiest, most honest thing he had ever said. She looked down at the dress, then back at him. A small, strange expression touched her mouth. It was not her usual smirk, the dry, hard humor of their journey. It was a small, real smile. It was unguarded, and it struck Asa Holloway harder than any bullet ever had. "We have a new problem," she said, the smile fading, though the softness remained in her eyes. "Rook?" he asked, his mind snapping back to the threat. "The gala. If we have to get close to that depot, we have to blend. You look like a roustabout. I look like a woman in a borrowed dress. We do not look like we belong. We do not," he said. "We have to learn." She pointed to an empty freight bay at the edge of the camp, its floor swept clean, lit by a single, high lantern. "Harlow's people waltz. We have to look like we can, too," he balked. "Marin, I am a freighter. I do not waltz. You know how to move," she said, walking toward the bay. "You guided a 2-ton wagon through a rock slide. This is just reading the land, but the land is me." He followed her into the square of yellow light. A distant fiddle from the main camp provided a thin, reedy rhythm. He stood, awkward. "What do I do here?" she said. She took his calloused right hand and placed it on her waist. His hand was rough, stained with dirt and grease. Her waist, through the navy cotton, was slender but strong. The contact was a jolt, sharp and sudden. He could feel the warmth of her body, the solid line of her spine. It was not the chaste, desperate touch at the mission, or the accidental heat of the wagon. This was deliberate. "And my other hand?" he asked, his voice thick. "Here." She laced her fingers with his, lifting their joined hands. They stood like that for a full second. He could smell the clean, sharp scent of the soap she had used, a faint trace of sage. "Now, move," she said. "1, 2, 3. Follow me." He was impossibly clumsy. His boots, heavy with dust, tripped over his own feet. He was used to the rolling gait of a man who walked, not the slide and turn of a dance. "You are fighting me," she said. "You are trying to lead. That is what the man does." He gritted, embarrassed. "Not this time. You do not know the steps. I do. Trust my lead. Feel the rhythm." He shut his eyes for a moment, let out his breath. He stopped thinking about his feet and focused on the pressure of her hand on his, the slight, guiding tension in her waist. He opened his eyes. He began to move. 1, 2, 3. They found a rhythm. It was hesitant, then stronger. He learned to anticipate her turn. She learned to trust his weight. They moved across the freight bay, 2 shadows circling in the lantern light. He was no longer a freighter, and she was no longer a surveyor. They were 2 parts of a single motion. He grew more confident. He guided her into a faster turn. She spun, but her heel caught a loose floorboard. She stumbled, her balance lost. Instinctively, he tightened his grip. He caught her, pulling her up and flush against his chest, saving her from the fall. She was pressed hard against him, her breath knocked out in a soft oof. His arm was locked around her waist, her hands flat against his chest. He could feel the frantic, sudden beat of her heart, or perhaps it was his own. She pushed back, not hard, not in anger, but with a firm, undeniable pressure. "No," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the night. He let her go, stepping back, confused. "You stumbled." "I know." She stood straight, her hands clasped in front of her, her face shadowed. "Do not do that. Do not catch me. That does not make any sense." "Marin, it makes perfect sense." She looked up, her eyes burning with an intensity that had nothing to do with the dance. "At the depot, at the auction, on the bridge. You are always saving me. I am the $3 burden. The woman you have to catch, I will not be that." She set the boundary, sharp and clean as a section line. "If I fall, you do not catch me. We move together, or we do not move. I will find my own footing. Do you understand?" He looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the iron in her spine, the desperate need to be a partner, not property. He remembered her words at the first camp. "Help me fight, not fix me." He had failed that test. He nodded slowly. "Together. Or not at all." "Together," she affirmed. She stepped back into his space, placed his hand on her waist, and took his hand. Again, they began to dance. This time, it was different. It was a true partnership. He did not pull. She did not push. Their bodies moved with a shared, learned trust. The fiddle music swelled. They slowed and stopped, coming to rest in the center of the bay. The music faded, but they did not let go. His hand was still on her waist. Hers was still in his. They were breathing in the same rhythm, their faces inches apart. In the distance, from Garnet Bluff, a sharp pop and a whistle, followed by a shower of green sparks in the night sky. A firework test. The sudden light cast his face in sharp relief. Asa's thumb, resting on the back of her hand, moved. It stroked, once, grazing the fine, fragile skin over her pulse. He felt it jump, a strong, steady beat against his calloused skin. He leaned in. She did not pull away. Her eyes were open, clear, watching his. Her breath hitched, just once. She leaned in, tilting her head. The kiss was there, hovering in the small, charged space between their mouths. It was an inch away, a heartbeat away. It was a choice they were both about to make. She stopped. She did not move back. She just stopped, her gaze holding his. Her fingers flexed against his chest. It was a deliberate, conscious halt. "After," she whispered. The word was a puff of warm breath against his lips. He did not understand. "When this is done," she clarified, her voice low, but fierce. "When we are not running. When it is not the plan, or the night, or the fear. When it is our choice." "Asa, not this." He looked at her, at the absolute, unshakable core of her. She was not rejecting him. She was postponing a promise. She was claiming the right to choose, a right that had been stolen from her with a $3 tag. He let out a long breath. A slow grin spread across his face. A real grin. One that reached his eyes. "After," he agreed. The word tasted like a promise. It hung between them, more solid and binding than any kiss. Garnet Bluff was on fire with celebration. The Founders' Day Gala was a glorious, drunken noise. A brass band blared a patriotic march from a bunting-draped gazebo, competing with the wheezing calliope of the Harlow Sons Carousel. The air was thick with the smell of roasted meat, cheap whiskey, and the sharp, sulphurous promise of fireworks. Asa and Marin moved through the crowd like ghosts. He was in his rough spun roustabout clothes. She in the severe, dark navy dress. They were a stark, somber island in the sea of bright calico and dark suits. They did not belong. They did not try to. Their target was the depot. According to their plan, The mail car with the Black Mesa safe should have been shunted to the siding at 3 o'clock, to be inspected. It sat there now, a dark, quiet rectangle of iron, just beyond the festive lights. They were a partnership forged in the empty freight bay, together, or not at all. He watched the depot guards. She watched the flow of the crowd, her mind a map of escape routes. They needed to wait, for the speeches to peak, for the fireworks to begin, for the guards to be drunk or distracted. Asa moved closer to the platform, trying to get a better view of the depot office. He was tense, his hand resting near the heavy wrench tucked into his belt, his only weapon. He backed into a man, a solid, unmoving presence. "Pardon me," Asa muttered. Turning, he was not looking at a rancher. He was looking at a tailored black wool suit, a silk vest, and a diamond stick pin. He was looking at the smooth, pale face of Ambrose Kilduff. Kilduff was not on the platform. He was moving through the crowd, a glass of champagne in his hand, his eyes scanning the celebration, and those eyes, cold and intelligent, landed on Asa. There was no surprise, only recognition, a flicker, fast as a snake's tongue. Kilduff's gaze moved from Asa to the woman beside him, lingering on the fine, taut line of Marin's jaw. Kilduff smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. It was a smile of ownership, of a man confirming an inventory. He raised his glass. The brass band hit a final, triumphant note. And in the sudden lull, Kilduff's voice, cultured and clear, carried, "A toast," he called out. People turned. The governor, on the platform, paused his speech and raised his own glass. Kilduff's eyes never left Asa. "To old scouts," he said, his voice ringing with false warmth. "And to new fortunes." The crowd cheered, drinking to a sentiment they thought was for them. Asa froze. The blood drained from his face. The toast was a knife, meant for him alone. Before he could react, the crowd before them parted. Sheriff Abel Hollander stepped through, his badge gleaming under the gala lights. 2 large railroad security men flanking him. He looked cleaner than he had in Dustwell, but his eyes were just as dull. "Asa Holloway," Hollander said, his voice a flat, official slam. The music, which had just begun to swell, faltered. People nearby turned, sensing a different kind of spectacle. Hollander held up a folded document, an arrest writ. "I have a warrant for the woman in your company." He pointed a thick finger at Marin. "Marin Kestrel, a fugitive from lawful quarantine, issued by the Dustwell County Assessor." The words hit the air. "Quarantine." A woman gasped. A man pulled his child back. The crowd did not mutter. It moved, like a tide pulling away from a diseased shore. People physically record, creating a circle of empty, trampled grass around Asa and Marin. The power of the yellow tag was absolute. Even in its absence, they were untouchable. Ambrose Kilduff stepped into that empty circle, his shoes immaculate. He stopped a foot in front of Asa, his presence blocking the lights of the gala. He lowered his voice, a conspiratorial, friendly whisper meant only for Asa's ears. "This is a messy, unfortunate business, son," Kilduff murmured, gesturing with his champagne flute. "You have been given poor advice. That woman, she is tainted, a burden. You do not belong in this." Asa stood, rigid, trapped by the ring of frightened faces and the calm, reasonable voice of the devil. "Here is what happens," Kilduff continued, his voice dropping further. "You give her to Hollander. You walk away. That freight contract to Sable Canyon, the one you wanted, it is yours. A 5-year exclusive. Guaranteed." Asa's jaw was tight, his mind reeling. "And more," Kilduff added, seeing the flicker in the freighter's eyes. "Absolution. Mr. Holloway, the past stays buried. No one needs to know what you really did for the Army. No one needs to know about the springs you flagged, the maps you drew, the lines that armed those land seizures. It was the offer of everything. Not just money, not just a future, but a clean past. Absolution." The word echoed the shrapnel in his ribs. A chance to have it dug out, once and for all. Marin was watching him. She had not heard the whisper, but she saw the transaction. She saw the sudden, agonizing conflict on Asa's face. She saw the hesitation. "Asa!" Her voice was sharp, a crack in the sudden, terrible silence. "What did he say to you?" He could not look at her. The shame was a physical weight, bending his neck. He was a scout, a man who found paths. And he was trapped. "He knows," Asa said, his voice thick. "He knows about my past." "What past?" Marin demanded, her hand gripping his arm. "Asa, what past?" The words tore out of him, a confession in the center of the hostile crowd, under the gaze of the man who held his entire life in the balance. "I told you I scouted for the army. Kilduff. He knows what I scouted. I did not just find passes. I flagged the springs, the hidden water sources, the maps I made. They were not just for the army. The land agents got them. They used my lines, to file on the land before anyone else." He was not just a freighter. He was not just a man with a stubborn conscience. He was the architect of the very crime he was now fighting. He had been the first, Marin's hand, the one that had rested on his forearm in the livery, the one that had held his in the freight bay, fell away from his arm as if she had been burned. Her face, which had held fear and tension, went blank. It was a terrifying transformation. The warmth, the promise of after, the shared trust of the dance, it all evaporated. The wall of basalt she had built around herself in dust wells slammed back into place, now 1,000 feet high, and he was on the wrong side of it. She looked at him, her eyes as dead and gray as ash. "The lines," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the band, which had nervously started a waltz. "The springs, the seizures." Her gaze was unblinking. It was not hatred. It was worse. It was recognition. It was a verdict. "You drew the lines," she said, her voice hollow. "You drew the lines they used to cage us." Asa looked from her shattered, closed face to Kilduff's smooth, expectant one. He saw the offer of absolution, a clean slate, a new fortune, and he saw Marin, who now knew him for what he was. He knew, in that instant, that absolution from Kilduff was just a finer, more expensive cage. He had lost her, the one thing he had not known he wanted. He turned his head slowly, meeting Kilduff's patient gaze. "Go to hell," Asa said. The smile vanished from Ambrose Kilduff's face. He did not raise his voice. He simply nodded, once, to Hollander. "Take them both." The railroad security surged forward. "Marin, the safe run!" Asa roared. He shoved her, hard, toward the carousel, away from the guards. She did not hesitate. She was a shadow. She bolted, ducking under a rope of red, white, and blue bunting. A firework exploded overhead, a shower of golden sparks and confetti raining down. And in that burst of light and chaos, she was gone, vanished into the thick of the crowd. Asa did not run. He turned and swung the heavy wrench from his belt, a desperate, hopeless act of diversion. He caught one guard in the gut. He shoved another. He broke free from the circle and ran, not toward Marin, but left, toward the dark alley between the depot and the Grand Hotel. He had to draw them off. He plunged into the darkness, his boots skidding on the gravel. He thought he was clear. He slammed into a solid wall of dark cloth. A hand shot out, grabbing a fistful of his shirt. He was spun, his back slammed hard against the brick wall, the impact driving the air from his lungs. In the dim light filtering from the gala, he saw the calm, clean-shaven face. "Eames Rook." "Messy," Rook said, his voice devoid of emotion. Asa lashed out, but Rook was a professional. He blocked the punch, twisted Asa's arm, and slammed him back against the wall. Asa heard a sharp, metallic click. A cuff snapped onto his left wrist. Rook was efficient, linking the other cuff to a heavy iron drain pipe. "A $3 purchase," Rook said, stepping back, adjusting his duster. He pulled a cigarette from his case. A poor investment. $3 bought a noose. Holloway. Marin, hidden behind a painted carousel wagon, had circled back. She had to get to the mail car. She heard the scuffle, the slam of a body against brick. She peered around the wagon's edge. She saw him, Asa, cuffed to the pipe. She saw Rook, a dark silhouette. Light, a match. She froze. Her heart was a hammer. Asa, the man who had bought her. The man who had bandaged her. The man who had danced with her. His thumb grazing her pulse. The man who had just confessed to drawing the maps that had caged families like her own. The man who had, in the end, refused the devil's bargain. He was trapped. She could help him. A diversion. A scream. She looked from the alley to the depot. The mail car sat, silent, its lamp unlit. Inside were the ledgers. The proof. The key to breaking Kilduff. To saving the orphans. To reclaiming the land for hundreds. The man, or the mission. Rescue one, or expose the one who had taken everything from so many. She clutched the map case to her chest. Her face was stone. Exposure saves more than rescue does. She turned her back on the alley and the man cuffed to the pipe. She slipped, silent as a shadow. Toward the train, in the alley. Hollander's men found Asa. They cursed, unlocked the cuffs from the pipe, and recuffed his hands behind his back. They dragged him out of the darkness, back into the mocking, festive light. They did not take him to the town jail. They marched him past the depot, past the platform, to the end of a long, dark freight train. A single car sat on the end, its windows barred. A prison coach. They shoved him up the steps. The heavy door groaned open. They threw him inside. The door slammed shut. The sound a solid, echoing finality. Asa stumbled in the pitch black. He found his feet and turned, pressing his face to the small, barred grate in the door. He could see the gala, the swirl of dancers, the spinning, painted horses of the carousel, their lights a blur of joyful color. A violent clank shook the car as the couplings engaged. The train lurched through the grate. Asa watched the carousel lights spin, then blur, pulling away, streaking into the dark. Marin did not watch the train pull away. She did not allow herself the luxury of a backward glance. The moment she turned from the alley, she was no longer a woman. She was a surveyor, and this was a problem of lines, trajectories, and timing. She ran, not toward the depot, but toward the maintenance sheds on the far side of the rail yard, a place she had sketched from her tent. The carousel music was a mockery, a soundtrack of joy while Asa was dragged away in chains. The music hammered at her, but she walled it off. The mission came first. The man was a casualty. She found it, a small, four-wheeled maintenance speeder, a handcar, sitting on a rusted spur. It was heavy, built for two men. She put her shoulder to it, her boots sliding in the cinders, and shoved. It did not budge. She repositioned, using her legs, a surveyor's strength, built from hauling equipment up mountains. The iron groaned. It moved. She got it onto the main outbound track, the same one the freight train had just taken. She threw her map case onto the flatbed and took her place at the pump handle. She began to work. The first few strokes were agonizing. The mechanism was stiff with rust and disuse, but the wheels turned. Clack, clack, clack. She pumped, her arms and back screaming, putting her whole body into the rhythm. The speeder moved, slowly, then faster. Clack, 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 clack. She was a solitary, frantic shadow, pumping her way out of Garnet Bluff, chasing the lumbering freight train into the dark. Her breath was a ragged tear in the night air. The promise of after was a cold, dead ash in her mouth. She had chosen. She had left him. Her map was in her head. The train was heavy, climbing the grade toward Redwater Flats, a high, desolate plain where the line straightened out. It would be slow. She was light. She could catch it. She would not catch it. She would pass it. She knew this line. She had surveyed the cut. 3 miles ahead, before the flats, was a water tower and a siding switch, manually operated, used for shunting cars. That was her target. Her plan was desperate, forged in the second she ran. The train consist was long. The mail car with the safe was near the front. The prison coach with Asa was at the end, and at the very end, as all freight trains had, was the caboose. She pumped, the rhythm a prayer of iron and wood. Clack, 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 clack. The fireworks from the gala were just faint pops of color to the south. Up ahead, she saw the train's marker lights. 2 red eyes, impossibly far away. An hour of brutal, back-breaking work. Her arms were numb, her bandaged wrists on fire, but the red lights were closer. The train was laboring up the grade. She was gaining. She did not slow. She passed the caboose, a dark box moving through the night. She saw a flicker of orange light in its window, a cigarette. Rook. She pumped harder, a new, cold fury in her. She passed the prison car. She did not look. She could not. She passed the long line of boxcars, the cattle cars, and finally, the mail car. She pulled ahead, into the darkness, pumping until her heart felt it would burst. She reached the siding, a dark, looming water tower, a switch stand with a heavy iron lever. She leapt from the speeder, sending it rolling on into the night, and ran to the switch. She pulled the lantern from its hook. It was, by God, lit. She signaled, green, green, red, the signal to stop. An emergency. Then, as she had learned from the depot, she grabbed the whistle pull, a long wire, and gave one long blast, a signal of an obstruction on the line. Far behind her, she heard the train's whistle answer. 2 short, confused blasts. Then the grinding, metallic scream of brakes. The train was slowing. She threw her shoulder against the switch lever. It was heavy, locked. She used the wrench from her belt, the one Asa had used, and smashed the lock. She put all her weight on the lever. With a heavy, grating clang, the points moved. The siding was open. She heard new sounds. Shouting. Horses. From the desert beside the track, not on it. Harlow's troop. As the slowing train approached the switch, its headlamp cutting a white cone in the darkness, the world erupted. From behind a stand of yucca, 3 of Harlow's wagons, pulled by draft horses, surged onto the tracks, a charge of paint and canvas. They overturned one wagon directly on the main line, crates smashing open, scattering sawdust and glittering debris. Acrobats, dressed as wounded men, threw themselves to the ground, splashing the gravel with buckets of bright red paint. A false wreck. A spectacle. The engineer, seeing the signal and the disaster ahead, slammed his brakes, sending a shuddering clang down the entire line of cars. The train groaned, wheels sparking, and lurched to a violent, shuddering halt. The mail car was 20 yards from Marin. The train crew piled out, lanterns swinging, yelling at the painted, bleeding men on the tracks. Harlow, in his ringmaster's coat, was bellowing, waving his arms, a magnificent performance of tragedy. No one saw the woman in the navy dress slip into the shadow of the mail car. Marin worked fast. The door was locked, but it was a simple freight lock. Her tools, a set of fine-gauge steel picks she used for instrument repair, made short work of it. The lock clicked. She slid the heavy door open and disappeared inside. Darkness, the smell of canvas mailbags and oiled steel. And the safe. It was there, bolted to the floor. She lit a small, shielded lantern. Her hands, steady now, went to work on the dial. This was her true work. Not fighting, calculation, precision. She ran her fingers over the cold metal, listening, feeling the tumblers. Click, clack, click. In the prison coach, the sudden stop threw Asa from the bench, slamming him hard against the forward bulkhead. His hands were cuffed behind him. He was bruised, but not broken. He heard the shouting outside, the chaos of the false wreck. He did not know what it was, but it was a chance. The door to his car scraped open. A railroad guard stood silhouetted, lantern held high. "Stay put. Holloway. Just a wreck up ahead." Behind the guard, a second man stepped into the car. Eames Rook. "I will check the prisoner," Rook said, his voice calm. He dismissed the guard. The door slammed, leaving them in the dim light of Rook's lantern. "Your carnival friends are persistent," Rook said, his voice almost admiring. "A good diversion, but pointless." He sat on the bench opposite Asa. "In an hour, this wreck will be clear. You will be on your way. She will be hunted. Kilduff will have his ledgers. The game is over." The game is not over until she says it is. Asa spat. Rook smiled, that thin, cold smile. She left you, Holloway, cuffed to a pipe. She made her choice, the ledgers, not the man. You were just the cost of doing business. $3. Wasted. The words hit Asa harder than the brick wall. She left you. The train lurched again. A violent, backward jolt as the engineer tried to assess the damage. The lurch threw Rook off balance. He stood, steadying himself. Asa saw his opening. It was not a plan. It was pure, desperate rage. As Rook turned, Asa sprang from the floor. He drove his head hard into Rook's face, a sickening crunch of cartilage and bone. Rook roared, not in pain, but in fury, blood streaming from his nose. Asa did not wait. He turned and kicked the lantern, plunging the car into blackness. He dove for the door, fumbling for the latch with his cuffed hands. Rook, blind, enraged, fired his pistol. The flash was blinding, the explosion deafening in the metal box. The bullet tore through the wooden wall, inches from Asa's head. Asa got the door open. He rolled out, falling hard onto the gravel and cinders, the cuffs tearing the skin on his back. Rain. It had begun without warning. Not a drizzle, but a sudden, violent deluge, as if the sky had torn open. It was cold, sharp, and sudden. Asa scrambled to his feet, running, his hands bound. He had to get free. He ran toward the end of the train, inside the mail car. The last tumbler clicked. Marin felt it, a deep, solid thunk. She grabbed the handle, pulled. The heavy door swung open. It was there, not gold, not money, paper, stacks of ledgers, bound in black leather, and on top, a separate, thinner book. She opened it. Kilduff's kickback list. Names, dates, amounts. She grabbed them, stuffing them into her leather map case. She heard the shot. Her blood went cold. She looked out the open door of the mail car. In the chaos of the fake wreck, in the sudden, sheeting rain, she saw him, Asa, running, cuffed, and behind him, Eames Rook, his face a mask of blood, his pistol in his hand. Rook fired again. Asa stumbled, but kept running, climbing the ladder to the caboose roof. He was trapped. Rook followed him up. Marin grabbed a coil of heavy rope from the mail car. She ran. The roof of the caboose was a nightmare. It was slick with rain, the wind tearing at them. Asa, his hands bound, had no balance. He slipped on the wet planks. Rook was on him. He did not shoot. He slammed his pistol into Asa's ribs. Then again. Asa fell, skidding toward the edge. Rook was a demon in the storm, grabbing the front of Asa's shirt, hauling him up, his bloody face inches away. "I told you," Rook snarled. "The game is over." He raised his pistol, this time to use as a club, to beat Asa from the train. "Rook!" The voice was a scream, ripped by the wind. Both men turned. Marin stood on the roof of the adjacent boxcar, 10 feet away, a chasm of churning black air between them. Her navy dress was plastered to her, her hair a wild, dark rope. Her eyes were burning. In her hand was the coil of rope. Rook laughed, a wet, bloody sound. "She came back for you, how sentimental." He let go of Asa and raised his pistol, turning it toward her. "We move together," Marin yelled, her voice a raw command, not a plea. She threw the line. The rope, weighted by the rain, uncoiled perfectly across the gap. It slapped Asa hard in the chest. He did not catch it. His hands were bound. He turned, letting the rope loop over his shoulder, trapping it against his body. Rook fired at Marin. The shot went wide, lost in a sudden, blinding crack of thunder. Marin did not flinch. She braced herself, planting her feet, pulling the rope taut. Asa anchored to her, threw his entire body backward, off the roof of the caboose. It was a terrible, desperate gamble. He pinwheeled, a dead weight on the end of the line. The force of his fall almost tore Marin from the boxcar. The rope snapped taut, searing her hands, but she held. Asa swung, a pendulum in the storm. He slammed, feet first, back into the side of the caboose. Then, using the momentum, he swung again. A violent, body-slamming arc. He slammed directly into Eames Rook. The impact was brutal. Rook had been focused on Marin. He did not see it coming. The two men, one bound, one bloody, crashed to the wet planks. Rook's pistol flew from his grasp, skittering over the edge. Asa, his hands still bound, was a frantic, desperate animal. He rolled, he kicked, he drove his head into Rook's chest. Marin was pulling, hand over hand, hauling on the rope, dragging Asa and Rook, who was tangled with him, toward her. Rook scrambled to his feet. He saw the open coal bin on the tender car just ahead. He grabbed Asa, trying to throw him into it. Asa went limp, then drove a boot into Rook's knee. The Pinkerton's leg buckled. He stumbled, losing his balance on the slick, rocking roof. He teetered for 1 second, his arms flailing, his eyes wide with surprise. Then he went over. He did not fall to the ground. He fell, with a heavy, muffled thump, into the darkness of the coal bin. Asa lay on the planks, gasping, the rain washing the cinders and blood from his face. Marin was there, crawling across the gap, her knife in her hand. She knelt over him, her face inches from his, the thunder sheeting the sky, illuminating them in flashes of blue-white light. She said nothing. She was breathing as hard as he was. She simply sawed at the rope around his shoulder, then, rolling him over, at the thick leather straps binding his wrists. The cuffs fell away. He was free. He rolled back, his raw wrists stinging, and looked up at her. She was there. She had come back. She had chosen the ledgers, and she had come back. He reached up, his hand tangling in her soaking hair. He pulled her down. This was not the waltz. This was not the hesitant, patient promise in the freight bay. It was a collision. He kissed her, and she kissed him back. A fierce, desperate, claiming. It was not gentle. It was rage and relief and choice, all at once. It tasted of rain and coal smoke and the metallic tang of fear. It was a drowning man's first breath. It was the after he thought he had lost, reclaimed in the violent, roaring, now. She broke the kiss first, pulling back just enough to breathe. Her forehead rested against his, her eyes closed. "After?" she murmured, her voice a ragged whisper against his mouth. "It looks a lot like now." He grinned, a wild, sharp expression. Below them, the train was still chaos. Harlow's men were still arguing with the crew. They had maybe a minute. Asa stood, pulling her up. "The ledgers!" She slapped the leather case, hugged to her chest. Safe. He looked back. The prison car was dark. The mail car was open. The rest of the train was a long, dark problem they did not need. He grabbed her hand and pulled her to the end of the caboose. He found the coupling pin, the heavy iron bolt that held the car to the rest of the train. "Together," he said. He pulled the pin. With a groaning clank, the caboose was free. Gravity took them. The caboose, no longer pulled by the engine, slowed, then began to roll. Gently at first, then faster, backward, down the long grade, away from the wreck. They slipped into the juniper night, the storm washing their tracks. The ledgers a heavy, world-changing weight in Marin's arms. The caboose rolled backward for 2 miles, a ghost ship carried by gravity, before the long, gentle grade finally slowed it to a stop. They were in the open desert, the storm passing as quickly as it had arrived, leaving the air washed clean and cold. The lights of Garnet Bluff were a faint, sulphurous glow to the south. They did not wait. They gathered the ledgers, the map case, and the 2 rifles from the caboose and began to walk. They walked for hours, cutting east, then north, circling the town. The sky turned from pitch black to a deep, bruised purple. By the time the first, thin, gray light of dawn touched the horizon, they were on the outskirts of Garnet Bluff. The town was a wreck. The gala had ended in chaos. The train derailment was the only thing anyone was talking about. Kilduff's men, Hollander's deputies, and Rook's remaining Pinkertons were in a furious, disorganized search, most of them riding west, toward the wreck. Asa and Marin, two exhausted, mud-streaked figures, walked unseen through the hungover alleys. They found Dr. Bramhall in the small, damp basement of his shuttered registrar's office. He was pale, his hands shaking, but he was there. "We have them," Marin whispered, her voice raw. She dropped the heavy, leather-bound ledgers onto his desk. The sound was a heavy, final thud. Bramhall's eyes went wide. He touched the books as if they were holy relics. "It is time," Asa said. "At 7 o'clock in the morning." A sound cut through the nervous quiet of Garnet Bluff. It was not a gunshot. It was not a train whistle. It was a bell. Clang, clang, clang. A deep, bronze, resonant sound. A sound of sanctuary, of mission, of prayer. It did not belong. Sister Calanthe Doyle stood on the top step of the Garnet Bluff courthouse. Beside her, mounted on a small, wheeled cart that Harlow's men had disguised as a carousel repair wagon, was the massive, ancient bell from St. Elora. She rang it. She rang it with a slow, steady, unyielding rhythm. People emerged from their homes, rubbing sleep from their eyes. They came from the hotel, from the saloons, drawn by the impossible sound. They were curious. They were angry about the chaos of the night. They had seen the broadsheets, the ones Harlow's men had plastered over town in the pre-dawn hours, the ones that read "land stolen by fake surveys." They flooded the square. They saw the grim-faced nun ringing the bell. They saw the small, fussy Dr. Bramhall, the man they knew, the registrar they had been told was ill, nailing something to the courthouse door. And they saw the woman. Marin Kestrel walked up the steps, the heavy, water-stained map case clutched to her chest. Her dress was still damp, torn at the hem. Her hair, no longer in a braid, was a wild, dark tangle, plastered to her head from the rain. She looked like a survivor. She looked like a fury. Asa Holloway stood 3 steps below her, his stance solid, his carbine held loose at his side. He was not her protector. He was her witness. He watched the crowd, his eyes missing nothing. Marin reached the top step. Calanthe stopped ringing the bell. The silence that fell was absolute. Marin opened the kickback ledger, her voice, raw with exhaustion but clear as the bell itself. Cut across the square. "Section line 22, she read, her voice shaking but gaining strength. "Parcel 3, owner Hezekiah Jones, seized for delinquent taxes. Price $4. A man in the crowd, an old farmer in worn overalls, flinched. Hezekiah. That was my brother. Section line 21. Marin continued, turning a page. Parcel 7. The Juniper Creek Spring. Owner the widow Jensen. Acquired April 10th. Survey filed May 1st. Murmurs, the dates, the names. They were not strangers. They were family. They were neighbors. That is the Mission Orphans' land, a woman shouted from the back. Marin's voice rose. A prosecutor's clarion. Parcel 9. Owner Thomas Flynn. Parcel 12. Owner Silas Croft, with every name. The crowd's confusion turned to a low, dangerous hum. This was not a rumor. These were their lives. Dr. Bramhall, his hands no longer shaking, held up 2 maps. Here, he shouted, his reedy voice cracking. Here is the lie he pinned Kilduff's forged plat to the courthouse wall. The deed map, it shows the river running straight. The legal line. Then he pinned Marin's field survey beside it. And here's the truth. Surveyed by Miss Kestrel herself, the river bends. The spring is on the orphan's land. He stole it all, the crowd saw it. The 2 river bends, the lie and the truth, side by side. The hum became a shout. Men who had come carrying torches in the night, searching for fugitives, now held them in the daylight as symbols of a different kind of justice. They began to lower, the light of the flames catching the cold, sharp understanding in their eyes, their minds, as one, sharpened. This was not a mob. It was a jury. Where is he? Where is Kilduff? A carriage, moving too fast, skidded into the square, pulled by 2 sweating black horses. Ambrose Kilduff. his face pale with rage. Stepped out. Sheriff Hollander was right behind him, his hand on his gun. "Disperse this rabble," Kilduff commanded. "Hollander, arrest that woman. She is a diseased fugitive." Hollander drew his pistol. You heard him clear the square. The crowd did not move. They closed ranks. A solid wall of farmers, merchants, and roustabouts. The torches did not move. "That," a new voice said, "will not be necessary. Sheriff." The voice was female, calm, and carried absolute authority. The crowd parted. A woman on a tall bay horse rode through. She wore a dark brown duster, and the badge on her coat was not a local tin star. It was a U.S. Marshal's shield. Marshal Lydia Harbrow. She had ridden in from the territorial capital, summoned by a week-old telegraph from a nervous doctor, Bram Hall. She dismounted, her boots landing solidly on the dirt. She looked at Kilduff, at Hollander's drawn gun, at the maps on the wall, and at the ledger in Marin's hand. "Miss Kestrel," Harbrow said, her voice a lawful calm in the center of the storm. "I believe that book is evidence in a federal fraud investigation." Marin handed her the ledger. Harbrow opened it. She read one line. She looked at Kilduff. "Ambrose Kilduff," she said, her voice ringing. "I have a warrant for your arrest on the charge of conspiracy to commit land fraud against the United States government." Kilduff's face went white. "This is an outrage. You have no jurisdiction, and you, Sheriff Hollander," Harbrow continued, "cutting him off, are under arrest for conspiracy, aggravated kidnapping, and filing false quarantine papers." Hollander looked at Kilduff, then at the crowd, then at the marshal. He saw the cold, lawful certainty in her eyes. He slowly, agonizingly, unbuckled his gun belt and let it fall into the dust. As the marshal's men cuffed Kilduff, the railroad magnate's eyes found Asa. He was shaking with rage. You were nothing. A $3 scout I offered you absolution." Asa looked at him, then at Marin, who was watching him, her face open, waiting. He stepped up, to her side, and put his arm around her waist. He held her, there, in front of the entire town. "I already found it," Asa said. The work took the rest of the day. One by one, the farmers and widows, the dispossessed families, stepped up to the table Marshal Harbrow had established on the courthouse steps. They signed depositions, their hands guided by Dr. Bramhall. Asa and Marin sat on the bottom step, watching. The sun was warm, the air clean. The nightmare was breaking. Asa reached into his pocket. He pulled out a folded, worn piece of paper. The bill of sale, lot number 7, $3. He looked at it. It was the leash Rook had spoken of. It was the paper that had started it all. He did not give it to her. He pulled a match from his vest, struck it on the stone step, and lit the corner of the paper. Marin watched as he held it. The paper curled, the ink turning brown, then black. He held it until the flames licked his fingers. Then he dropped it into a small tin. They watched together as the proof of her ownership, his purchase, his rescue, burned to fine gray ash. She was free. Their lodgings that night were in a small, clean room over the general store. The celebration in the street below was loud, but up here, it was quiet. The soft rain, which had returned after sunset, ticked on the tin roof. A gentle, hushing sound. A single lamplight filled the room with a warm, amber glow. They stood in the center of the room, not touching. The day was done. The fight was over, and the silence was filled with the promise of after. They undressed the day, not each other, not at first. Asa sat on the small cot, his body heavy with a fatigue so deep it was in his bones. He pulled off his muddy boots. They hit the floor, one after the other, with a heavy, final thud. Marin unpinned her dark, damp hair, letting it fall, heavy and tangled, over her shoulders. She unbuttoned her navy dress, her hands shaking, not with fear, but with relief. The dress pooled at her feet. She stood in her simple cotton shift, her bare feet on the cool wooden floor. He stood and took off his own damp coat. His hands were raw from the cuffs, stained with rope burns and coal dust. He looked at them, then at hers. which were wrapped in Calanthe's healing salve. He stepped toward her. He did not reach for her body. He reached for her hands. He took them, his rough, scarred palms enclosing her bandaged ones. He held them, just held them, as their shaking finally stilled. He looked at her, his gaze clear, his past finally silent. She looked back, her eyes, the color of slate, now soft as the rain. He raised one hand, his calloused thumb tracing the sharp, proud line of her jaw, a jaw that had been held high in defiance at the auction. "Marin," he whispered. It was the first time he had said her name when it was not a warning or a question. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing. He lowered his head. The kiss was not the desperate, rain-soaked claiming on the train. It was deep. It was tender. It was a vow. It was the slow, unhurried kiss of two people who had all the time in the world. A kiss that tasted of relief and promise and a future they had chosen. He lifted her, and she was light in his arms. He carried her to the cot and laid her down, pulling the heavy quilt over them both, a shield against the cold, against the past. The prose of the room lingered on the details, the lamplight on his bare shoulders, the way his breath synced with hers, a shared, quiet rhythm. The quilt slipped, and his hand rested on the bare, smooth curve of her shoulder, his fingers tracing the line from her neck to her arm, a gesture of quiet reverence, not a possession. She was not his property, she was his partner. She whispered against his chest, her voice muffled by the quilt. "No more cages, not even the ones we build for ourselves." He kissed the top of her head, his own voice rough with an emotion he did not know he possessed. "No more running," he vowed. "Not from what we want." Outside, in the quiet, rain-washed darkness, the distant whistle of a late-night train sounded. It was not the cough of a metal bull, not a threat, not a sound of conquest. It was just a sound, the sound of distance, and it was going the other way. The winter that followed the reckoning at the courthouse was a bitter one, sharp with wind and biting snows, but it was a clean cold. The fear that had lived under the skin of Garnet Bluff, the greasy, quiet control of Ambrose Kilduff, was gone. When the spring thaw came, it was not just the creeks that ran free. Months passed, the sun grew high and hot again, turning the mud to dust. 6 months after the trial, the town was the same and entirely different. The Black Mesa rail office, its windows boarded over, remained a dark, hollow tooth in the town's smile. But across the square, a new sign had been hung. It was painted on fresh pine, the letters simple, bold, and black. The Juniper Cooperative Freight and Survey. It was not a grand office. It was the old general store, purchased at auction from Kilduff's seized assets. But the business was not built on one man's name. A board was hammered to the wall by the door, and on it, a growing list of shareholders, teamsters who had bought in with their wagons, farmers who had paid with futures on their grain, the widows from Juniper Creek, their restitution money invested. Even Harlow & Sons Carousel Troupe was listed, a full partner. It was a business built on shared lines, not stolen ones. Marin Kestrel's office was the depot platform. She stood where she had once been sold, but she was not bound by iron. She was surrounded by a half-dozen homesteaders, their wives, and their children, all leaning over the maps she had spread on the sun-warmed planks. She was teaching them. "You do not need to be a cartographer to read the land," she said, her voice clear and patient. She was not the same woman, the one with the cold, slate-gray eyes. The fire was still there, but it burned now as a warmth. "Not a weapon. You look for the water. You follow the contours. This line is the boundary of your deed. This one, the government survey. They must match. If they do not match, you come here. You do not sign. You do not run." She tapped the vellum, her finger, no longer bandaged, tracing a hard, true line. "You come to the co-op. We will fight. The land is yours. Do not let any man with a clean suit and a smooth voice tell you that you do not see what you see." As she spoke, 3 children were playing nearby, their knees thick with dust. They had a piece of chalk, taken from the co-op supply board. On the same wooden platform that had once looked so much like a gallows. They were drawing. They drew straight, clumsy, wavering section lines on the planks. It was a game, a form of hopscotch, their laughter echoing as they jumped from one parcel to another. The lines held no peril for them. They were just play. Asa Holloway ran the freight. He still had prim and chaff, though the mules were fat and spoiled. Used now only for short runs, he had hired 3 new teamsters, men who had lost their contracts under Kilduff's monopoly. He ran the routes he had always known, but he ran them differently. He hauled mining equipment, yes, but he also hauled seed for the homesteaders, lumber for the new schoolhouse, and on the wall of the co-op, for all to see, was a large hand-drawn map, Asa's map. It showed his routes, the freight schedules, and the rates, published openly, when a rancher from the high mesas, a man who had notoriously sided with Kilduff, tried to hire him. Asa had looked at the man's order, then at his map. "I cannot take it," Asa had said, his voice mild. "Why not? My money is good. It is not your money. It is the route." Asa had tapped the map. "My route runs here. Your land is over there. It means crossing the old Juniper Creek line, the one that was stolen. But it is the fastest way. It is just ground not to me," Asa said. "We do not cross stolen ground. We will take the long way around." It was a policy that cost them time, but it bought them a different kind of currency. It bought them trust. Sister Calanthe Doyle had discovered that her true faith was in the printed word. She had moved the mission's heavy, ancient hand press from St. Elora, not into the church, but into the building that had once been the town jail. The iron bars were taken down and reforged by the blacksmith into harness rings and plowshares. Where Sheriff Hollander's desk had sat, the press now stood. She called her new enterprise the Juniper Ledger. Dr. Bramhall was her editor and typesetter. Her first editorial, printed on rough paper and posted in every shop in town, had been short, only 5 words. "Land is not a rumor." The final word on the matter rode into town on a tired bay horse. Marshal Lydia Harbrow dismounted, her duster covered in the dust of a long ride from the territorial capital. She found Asa and Marin in the co-op office, going over the accounts. "I came to close the books," the marshal said. She did not smile, but the hard lines around her eyes had softened. She accepted the tin cup of water Marin offered. "We heard the conviction stood." Asa said, "They did." Harbrow took a long drink. Kilduff was found guilty on all counts: conspiracy to commit fraud, illegal seizure, mail fraud. The list was long. He will be in a federal prison for 20 years. He will not see this territory again. And Hollander Marin asked, her voice quiet, "Conspiracy, filing false documents, 10 years. Rook, the Pinkerton, was not so lucky. He was found in that coal bin, half dead. He tried to fight the rail guards who found him. He will be breaking rocks in a Yuma prison." Harbrow set the cup down. "The best news: the court seized Kilduff's assets, all of it. His land, his shares in the railroad, his accounts. It is all being liquidated. The Territorial Fund has authorized full restitution, to be administered by a board." She nodded at Marin. "Dr. Bramhall, Sister Calanthe, and you, Miss Kestrel. The families will get their land back. The orphans will get their spring. The lines, once drawn in deceit, were finally being drawn true." It was market day in Garnet Bluff. The square, once a place of fear and hushed rumors, was alive. The sound of laughter was real. Harlow's troupe was in town, the carousel calliope playing a bright, cheerful tune. Farmers had their wagons open, selling corn and squash. Asa was by a wagon, haggling with a rancher over the price of new leather harness, his voice easy, a grin on his face. He looked comfortable in his own skin, a man at peace with the ground he stood on. He felt a hand slide into his. He turned. Marin. She was not in her surveyor's clothes. She was in a simple blue cotton dress, her hair tied back with a ribbon. She said nothing. She just smiled, a small, private expression meant only for him, and tugged. He let himself be led. his laughter trailing behind him as he tossed an apology to the rancher. She pulled him away from the shouting vendors, away from the music, away from the bright, hot sun. She led him into the deep, cool shade of the cottonwood grove that grew behind the ledger office, a place of quiet green. The noise of the market faded, replaced by the high, gentle rustle of the leaves. The sun pushed through the canopy, dappling their faces in moving patterns of gold and light. She stopped, turning to face him. She did not let go of his hand. He reached up with his free hand, his thumb brushing a stray piece of cottonwood fluff from her hair. "What was that all about?" he asked, his voice low. "You looked like you were enjoying yourself too much," she whispered, her eyes playful. "I cannot have my best freighter spending all the co-op's money on harnesses we do not need." "I was winning," he protested, grinning. "I am sure you were." She stepped closer, into his space. Her hands came up to rest on his chest. His own arms circled her waist, pulling her gently against him. They stood for a long moment, just breathing, the heat of the day and the heat of their bodies threading together, a warmth that was no longer desperate, no longer sharp with fear. It was a warmth that was threaded with home. He kissed her. It was not the desperate, rain-soaked collision on the roof of the train. It was not the tender, exhausted vow in the lamplit room. This was a kiss that was as unhurried as the summer afternoon, a kiss that knew it had all the time in the world. It was deep and slow and sure. It was the kiss of a man and a woman who had chosen, and who would choose each other every day. She rested her head against his shoulder, her breath warm on his neck. He let out a low chuckle, the sound a happy vibration against her cheek. "I was just thinking," he murmured, "about that day in Dustwell at the auction." She pulled back just enough to look up at him, her brow furrowed. He was grinning. "I reckon those $3 I spent on you, that was the best down payment I ever made." Marin stared at him for a second. Then she laughed. It was a full, genuine laugh, a sound of pure, unguarded joy. She shoved him, lightly. "A down payment, Asa Holloway. You are impossible. You still think you bought something." She poked a finger into the center of his chest, her eyes alight with a fierce, loving humor. "It was not ownership, freighter. It was never about that. It was not a leash, and it was not a down payment." She grew serious, her palm flattening over his heart. "It was proof," she said, her voice soft. "It was proof that in the middle of all the lies, we still had a choice. They lived in the rooms over the co-op. They were small, clean, and filled with light on the simple wooden mantelpiece. Next to a stack of Marin survey maps and the worn stone Asa used to sharpen his knives, sat a small, square frame. It was not a painting. It was not a certificate. It was two pieces of glass, pressed together, and sealed between them, a scattering of fine, gray ash, the ashes of the $3 bill of sale, the paper he had burned on the courthouse steps. It was their only reminder, a reminder of a lie they had outlived, a reminder that their life together was not a transaction, but a choice, made freely, and paid for in full. The sun was setting. The day's work was done. Two silhouettes stood on the flat roof of the depot, looking out over the town. The golden hour light, that last, perfect flood of red and gold, washed over the high desert, turning the distant mesas a deep, royal purple. Asa and Marin stood side by side, his arm around her waist, her head resting on his shoulder. They were not looking for riders. They were not planning an escape. They were surveying the horizon, a horizon that was vast and clean and quiet, a horizon that, at last, belonged to everyone they loved and to themselves. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We are so curious where you are listening from. Please let us know in the comments and share your thoughts on Asa and Marin's journey. Subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 like this video. And if you can, please support us by hitting that hype button to help this story be heard by many more.